On episode 35 of Confessions of a Marketer, we're revisiting GDPR with Jacques van Niekerk. Welcome back to Confessions of a Marketer. I'm Mark Reed Edwards. Today we have Jacques van Niekerk, Wunderman Data CEO, on to talk about the effects of GDPR on marketers. That's today in the first part of our interview. Next time, we'll dissect Amazon, Apple, and Google's points of view in all the chatter about privacy. So we'll get to part one of that chat in just a moment. We've got episodes on conversational marketing, doing a rebrand, telling stories with data, along with a collaboration I'm undertaking on innovation. We might launch a separate podcast for chats about that, but we'll have a pilot sometime in November or December. Thought maybe we could get it launched sooner, but schedules are tough this time of year with Thanksgiving just around the corner, believe it or not, here in the U.S. So stay tuned. On to Jacques van Niekerk. Jacques and I first chatted last May about GDPR and what we could expect. Now, about 5 months out from GDPR, I thought it would make sense to check in with him to see what the effects have been. Jacques is CEO of Wunderman Data, the very firm that pretty much invented direct marketing, so he speaks from experience and a broad client roster. This chat was so interesting, and there was so much to talk about in the news, that I asked him back for a part two to chat about all that. But here's part one. First, let's get to it. Jacques, welcome back to the podcast. How was your summer?
Very good. Thank you. Busy, but that's the way I like it. And it's really good to be back on the show.
GDPR was what, 5-6 months ago?
25th of May.
And, it happened and the world's still here. I've still got a pulse. How have marketers fared over the last 5 or so months?
That's right. I remember you and I said, is the world going to end? No, it's not going to end. But I will say, let me get onto the marketers in a second, because I think there's a couple of quick baselining of what's happened since the 25th that's probably going to be really important. I think what we've seen is the complaints should it spike, and I would say the regulators are reaching for their fine books.
Right.
I think that's really what's happened, but the world hasn't ended. But we've seen some interesting things in the United Kingdom. When GDPR came into effect, those first couple of weeks, the regulators there, it's called the ICO, had 160% increase in the first few weeks in access requests, and many of the other regulators have been receiving a lot of requests. So they're trying to figure out, exactly what is legitimate, which are the ones that they really need to focus on, and that's why at some level, it's not like there's been a plethora of enforcements taking place, but it's not like complaints have not been filed. But we ultimately believe the enforcement will go where the complaints are, and early on, that tends to be against the big walled gardens or the larger platforms that draw most of the attention. And I think, as you and I talked about a little bit the last time, all the attention that Facebook had attracted to itself, and Google to an extent, even prior to GDPR, they've already been on notice before this happened. And wherever there's any geopolitical or political campaigning associated with the platforms, for example, the Crimson Hexagon and Cambridge Analytica positions that Facebook found themselves in, I think that's still going to play out. Because most recently, the ICO in the UK has formally taken GDPR enforcement against a Canadian company called AIQ. And, they've been seen to use commercial behavioral targeting for political campaigning as part of the Brexit campaign in the UK. So it's quite interesting that was one of the first bits of enforcement that's taken place. But I think equally in this vein, Equifax and Facebook both paid fines of about £500,000 under the previous Data Protection Act, which preceded GDPR. But I think you would have seen it in the press. Facebook had another data breach at the end of September involving 50 million customers. So the big headline is, will they potentially now be fined under GDPR? And if so, people estimate that could be up to 1.6 billion.
Oh,
so that's a
real number. Yeah,
that's a real number. And is that going to happen? I don't know. This is the interesting one for us to keep an eye on. But to your first question, what does this mean for the marketers? And I'd say on the ground floor, away from the headlights and the headlines of the walled gardens, I think it's more a case of partly sunny than partly cloudy. I'd say sunny in that many are using this as an opportunity to spring clean and get their house in order. I'd say there is a bit of cloud around, because what we've seen practically is happening is there's almost a two-tier reality playing out for marketers. Some are so cautious and feel they're so behind on really having a good handle on their first party and their customer data that they are, sadly, in my opinion, they are defaulting more to contextual advertising. Right. So for those listeners who don't know, contextual is basically using content triggers as a way to personalize your marketing or your marketing campaign or your creative or your content. And that's not necessarily the best proxy, in my opinion, for personalization, true personalization, or great customer experience. And often contextual advertising can go horribly wrong. So I think there's sadly a quick kind of default to contextual advertising as just a quick means to get campaigns out and to attempt personalization. But I do think, fortunately, some very brave marketers are really deepening their efforts around first-party data. They're thinking about deterministic data sources. And they're realizing that if you get on top of it, it's actually easier to maintain consent wherever you have a direct relationship with the customer. And ultimately, if you have a direct relationship, it's a better way to drive value and be closer to your customers and not be disintermediated, which I think is the way marketers need to think of GDPR.
So what changes have you seen, on the marketing landscape after GDPR? What's changed?
Yeah, so as a data guy, I'm going to have to bring some data points to this conversation, right? So,
and that's why I have you here. So,
Mark, yeah. So I think the first thing we've seen, and this is a very interesting bit of research that came out of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, is that we've seen over a 22% drop in third-party cookie use across European pages.
Right.
So that's pretty dramatic. Just under a quarter. I think that number's going to gradually increase over time. So for marketers, this means that an overdependence on third-party cookies as part of your marketing arsenal is going to be a problem. So how do you do personalization without being solely dependent on third-party cookies, which gets back to my contextual marketing point, right? And then one which I didn't see coming, and this is from Neiman Labs, was that over 1,000 US news sites are unavailable to European readers 2 months after GDPR. And some of these are pretty substantial publications, the LA Times and Boston Globe as an example. So, for a marketer, it kind of limits especially if you're a global marketer trying to do any kind of geo-targeting or trying to target expatriates or trying to understand people across specific publications, regardless of where they're based, it limits your reach. So I think that's making it a little bit harder in the near term for marketers. And then another shakeout we're seeing, which we anticipated, but I really think it's better. There's been a massive rise in programmatic media, basically auction-based buying and selling of not only media inventory and content, but also the data and the customers that come with that content. And we are seeing a lot of the demand-side platforms taking quite a stance on the supply side or the sell side platforms. And they're trying to make sure there isn't this long string of people reselling other people's content.
Right.
So there's this notion of only one or maximum two hops in the process. And I think for anybody in media and publishing, I think that's a good development. And there's also a lot less manipulation of the media auction process taking place. And again, I think that's very positive. So, I've heard horrible stories of people selling media inventory as a broker or a reseller to a site that doesn't even run video, as an example, right? Just to get that higher CPM. So I think all those things are being flushed out. And it's one of those unintended but positive consequences of GDPR is that the whole ad tech ecosystem has really taken a long, hard look at itself, which actually goes broader than just the initial intentions of GDPR, in my opinion. And again, I think that's positive. And then we're seeing many of the major ad tech players for kind of marketing cloud type solutions are working very hard to comply and making it easier for clients to manage permission. And, just speaking to my team over the last couple of weeks, we are definitely seeing an increase in requests for proposals out in the market where clients are looking to customer data platforms or customer engagement platforms as a way to invest in and manage their first-party data across channels, to take a more omni-channel view because they're realizing they can't be overly dependent on digital third-party based channels. They've got to think about everything, their own estate, their own apps,
Right.
their own call centers, their own websites. So again, I think that's a very positive development for the marketplace.
One thing that occurs to me is Brexit going to affect GDPR? Will Great Britain conform to GDPR? Is there any understanding in that area?
That's a good question. So at the moment, for all intents and purposes, the United Kingdom is still abiding by GDPR. The example I gave you was the ICO, which is the British enforcement agency for GDPR, is actually proactively enforcing and taking a position there. Yeah, and they were one of the leading lights in helping shape and develop GDPR. So,
Right.
so for now, it's seen as part of the GDPR kind of block and process, if you like.
I'm wondering whether back in the spring when we said that there's a way to look at GDPR as a positive, maybe were we overly optimistic, or have you had clients that look at this as a win?
Yeah, maybe we were, Mark, to be honest. Maybe it's because it was early spring, and as I recall, it was a beautiful sunny day when we had the call. I think it's a bit early to call victory. But with that said, we are seeing kind of meaningful progress. The points I made above about how the whole value chain, specifically on the technology and the media and the data side, is starting to clean itself out. But we are seeing marketers putting a real focus on their first-party data, but specifically about data ownership. Who owns the data? How does that impact my customer relationship and my customer experience? How do I apply data in a better, more meaningful way? So I think there's this real notion that if you really think about customer experience and customer design, you have to put data in front and center as part of that process. It's if you want to really deliver personal and more human-centered marketing, people-based marketing, if you will, people-based marketing needs people-based data. And I think the smart marketers have always known that. And they're seeing GDPR and privacy by design as a filter to support that aspiration.
Right.
So we are seeing clients taking that position. So I think it's meaningful progress. Is it victory? Not quite yet, because I think we're only a couple of months post the summer. We're now in the fall, and I think between now and maybe a year or so out, I think the landscape will look significantly different, given some of the points I've shared earlier.
Okay, let's move to the U.S. where we are right now. It's actually a sunny fall day here in the U.S. where I am, and there is a bit of action going on with California's Consumer Privacy Act, and maybe even some hints at maybe something at the federal level, unclear. But how do you think that could shape up, and how would that affect marketers in the good old U.S. of A.?
I spoke with our Chief Privacy Officer, Rachel Glasser, about this. And, our view is, as marketers and people in the industry, it will be very hard for us to manage data protection laws for 50 different states. And I think it will be very confusing for the public and a real challenge for businesses and marketers at large to understand and comply. So, maybe a federal legislation will be more beneficial to both marketers and end consumers and the public. But one standard, let's say the California process and legislation goes through, that would then be the highest standard. And by default, people would almost have to apply that, right? There are some nuances and difference between what is being proposed in California versus GDPR. And I think that's where it starts getting difficult for marketers. And we don't want marketers in the industry at large to kind of just lose kind of faith in the whole process because it becomes so fragmented and so complex.
Sure.
Because ultimately this is trying to protect the public, and I think that's a positive thing. So, we even seeing in Brazil, they're starting to talk about similar type legislation. So it's starting to happen on a larger scale, and I think as the benefits of GDPR become clearer, I think we'll see more countries at a federal and national level outside of the EU adopt similar kind of privacy legislation and privacy acts.
Do you think there are industry groups and companies by themselves that might just say, well, let's look at GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act and maybe what's going on in Brazil or elsewhere, and synthesize that so that there's kind of a standard for companies to adhere to in the absence of legislation?
Industry bodies are definitely getting involved. I know the DMA is getting involved, the AIA is getting involved here in the US. So a lot of the industry bodies are trying to lean in, especially when the California legislation was proposed. There was a real concerted effort. And in speaking to some of and quite interesting, outside of the normal industry bodies, a lot of the technology companies in the ecosystem are all getting together and saying, hang on, let's start self-regulating, let's start self-imposing certain things here to make sure that we can drive this in a positive way. And again, I think this is all positive for the industry. I think digital grew so quickly and it fragmented the market and it opened up so much data as a consequence that there's now a little bit of a consolidation process and a little bit of a maturing of the industry. And I think that's positive for everybody.
Yeah, and you make the point about the growth of data and it kind of coming out of nowhere in the last 20 years or so, and it's these companies live on their data, so having good practices around it seems to make solid business sense, doesn't it?
Completely. There was a beautifully published article about a year or so ago in The Economist that referred to data as the new oil. I don't know if you saw that, but that analogy, it kind of stuck with me. And, if data is the new oil, then the last thing we want is, oil spills everywhere. And I think that's what's been happening, to use that analogy. So how do we in a more safe and more environmentally friendly way, mine the oil, refine the oil, and distribute clean fuel, right? Yeah. And I think at the moment, not only are we having a whole lot of data spills, i.e., what happened with Facebook and Equifax and a whole lot of the others, but we're also not necessarily refining, distributing that oil in the most safest and cleanest way that we possibly can. So I think the whole industry is starting to acknowledge that there's more work to be done. Yeah, and we weren't in this position, 18 months ago, even 12 months ago, I'd say.
I guess the only difference is that in 50, 60, 70 years, we're going to run out of oil. But
exactly, we're not going to run out of data.
Data is going to be here forever, and it's going to determine people's lifestyles. It's going to determine pretty much every aspect of your life, right?
Absolutely. It's like the air we breathe. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Jacques, as always, thanks for joining me here on Confessions of a Marketer. It was a pleasure having you here.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Mark. All the best.
Thanks to Jacques for being here. As I noted, next time, Jacques and I will dissect Amazon, Apple, and Google's points of view in all the chatter about privacy. Stay with us. This episode of Confessions of a Marketer was written, produced, and edited by yours truly. T. Jordan of A-Class Productions wrote the theme music. Confessions of a Marketer is a trademark of Reed Edwards Global Inc., and this episode is copyright 2018. I'm Mark Reed Edwards. See you next time.